Hello, and welcome to the London Book Club. Whether you were with us last week or not, we welcome you to the second of a four-part series looking at the adaptation of two novels into films by Alfred Hitchcock, both set in London. The first, Marie Belloc Lowndes' The Lodger, published in 1913, which was adapted into the film of the same name in 1927, which we'll discuss today. And the second novel by Joseph Conrad, The Secret Agent, published in 1907, which became Hitchcock's film Sabotage, released in 1936. And we'll take up those two pieces in the later parts of this series. I am Father Jim Leese, a priest of the Congregation of Holy Cross and the academic lead in the Notre Dame London program. And I'm happy to be your host today. It is our hope that over the course of the next few weeks, we will continue to build a virtual community and connect with people globally to reflect on the material presented, the genius of Hitchcock, the marvels of the City of London, and the great wisdom of Susan Omer. We're thrilled with the number of people who have registered for this event, over 533 by last count. We have formatted the book club, as those of you who have been with us know, with as much interaction and engagement as possible through discussion boards and breakout sessions. We'll mix up our platform a little bit today to give additional time to a special guest to the book club, Karen Webb from the British Film Institute, whom Susan will introduce to you shortly and engage in conversation about his work. We hope that you'll find your experience with the London Book Club insightful and engaging, and we hope you stay connected not only to us at the London Global Gateway, but also to the the Notre Dame network globally that is represented by the geographic diversity of this group gathered. You're from all over the world. The reach of Notre Dame's efforts through the Office of Notre Dame International and by the programming offered by ThinkND and the Notre Dame Alumni Association. At this time, I want to reiterate our thanks to our partners who have made the London Book Club possible. The London Global Gateway has been supported in this effort by the College of Arts and Letters, the Office of Notre Dame International, the DeBartolo Performing Arts Center, the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, Notre Dame Learning, and especially the Notre Dame Alumni Office and Alumni Association, without whose robust support we would not be able to pull this off each week. As we have such a large group this afternoon, we ask you to use the Google form that is coming through in the chat function at the bottom of your screen to send in your questions. We'll try to answer as many of them as possible, but it is likely that we won't be able to get to them all. We do have a private discussion board, however, on LinkedIn, where we invite you to contribute to the conversation with Professor Omer between the live sessions that we have weekly. And now I'd like to introduce you to my colleague and friend, Susan Omer, a professor here at Notre Dame who is also a dear friend of the London Global Gateway, having spent a couple of summers in London and also a recent semester teaching our Notre Dame students who study in London. She brings a great love for the City of London and a knowledge of the effort it takes to bring a work of literature to the big screen. Her focus on Hitchcock is appropriate in that he is London born, and his remarkable career began in London. Professor Omer teaches classes in film and television history and culture, courses such as media and presidential elections, Alfred Hitchcock, and a course on Walt Disney. I know she includes some work of J.K. Rowling adapted into the films of Harry Potter. And as Susan has said, she gets to teach all the fun stuff, and I think our students would agree. A more detailed biography of Susan can be found on the ThinkND website. As you may know, when we promote each of these weekly events, we share a few pre-recorded videos that are posted on the ThinkND website, where Susan provides a very fine overview of our topic for each day. For those of you who have not had a chance to watch them, I recommend checking them out at your leisure. Susan, the warmest of welcomes to you today and to our guests. Take it away.
Father Jim, thank you so much for that warm introduction and for introducing us and helping us get started each week. I really appreciate it. And as you may all remember from last week, today we have a very special guest. I am just thrilled that he is able to meet with us. I want to introduce Karen Webb, whom you will see on your screen. Karen is the Film Conservation Manager at the British Film Institute in London. And in that role, he is responsible for coordinating all of the technical work involved in film restorations that the British Film Institute carries out. That means that he was the crucial person in the restoration of The Lodger. Now, Karen, I think it's fair to say that the British Film Institute may be the single most important film organization in the UK. You may agree, but would you tell us a little bit about the overall work of the BFI?
Yes, hi, hello to everyone. Thanks for that very generous welcome, Susan. It's a great pleasure to be joining you and to be seeing that wonderful view of London behind you there. The BFI certainly is the lead body for film in the UK. It was established in 1933, so very early on. It's one of the earliest film institutes, and the National Archive, where I'm based, as it's now called, the BFI National Archive, was formed only 2 years later. So it's very shortly after Hitchcock made the Lodger, really. Within a decade, the archive was already being established. And the BFI's role in UK film and television culture is to foster the art and appreciation and the record of daily life that moving images can be. So there's this internationally important collection of film and British television here. And the film collection contains many examples, especially from the silent era, of other nations' productions. For example, I understand we're the second largest collection of American silent film, including those within the US. So there's a...
Thank you for that. We appreciate it.
So we're often in touch with the Library of Congress, for example, and the other major US archives and those around the world in loaning and indeed borrowing from others, as we did with the Hitchcock restoration program. And the BFI also runs cinemas, public cinemas on London's South Bank, including an IMAX cinema. But the main cinemas have run for decades and seen many well-known filmmakers on stage being interviewed, including Hitchcock, of course, and continue to run a really important program of cinema history as well as brand new releases. We help co-produce or provide production funding for new films, and we run a large education department within the BFI, so which supports and again fosters this interest in film and television learning. One thing finally I've just mentioned in that introduction, which I'm sure doesn't do justice to the full range of all my colleagues' activities, is the magazine Sight and Sound, which you may know because every decade since 1952, it's run a poll of filmmakers, film programmers, critics, for them to vote on the 10 best films ever made. And every decade since 52, Citizen Kane came top of that poll. And then in 2012, the year of the Hitchcock 9 restorations, Vertigo took its place, becoming becoming only the second film in that position after Kane. So that's a very brief but gives an indication of the scope of the BFI's activities.
I'm really glad you mentioned the BFI's, one of its locations on South Bank, because when our students study abroad in London, they live in a residence hall that is about 1.5 blocks away from that location. In fact, you mentioned the IMAX theater, they're across the street from it. So one of the things we emphasize is, hey, you're in London, there's an IMAX theater outside your front door. So that's great for them. But The BFI, as you said, also has a library right there on South Bank, the Rubin Library. And
Yes.
the librarians there are fantastic in helping students and helping faculty with our research as well. Sarah Current in particular has been wonderful to my class. So it's just, people are so welcoming and so helpful. It's just really a pleasure to have the BFI right there.
Yeah, moving the library, which happened, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, to the reading room, to the cinema, was fantastic. It used to be on another site in London, but this has opened up the activities, and as you say, a brilliant team there, really dedicated to making sure people can get to access the materials they need to.
I will put the link for it actually in our LinkedIn page for those of our participants who might be interested. I'll just say too, because I like this kind of thing, the BFI Center on South Bank has a wonderful gift shop. I'm not too ashamed to say that there's a shopping tip if anybody's interested, but lots of film books, DVDs that are course specific for the UK, but all sorts of film related posters, lots of Hitchcock posters too. So, you know, if you're shopping for people who love movies, it's a wonderful place to go.
It is, yeah, that's true.
So you mentioned, obviously, you're crucial in the restorations that the BFI does. Would you tell us the kinds of general films that the BFI have done and what projects you've been involved in? And that's a huge range, I know. So pick whichever
Yes.
think you're interested.
Yeah. Well, this is the really fun thing, because our collection contains examples. Not every, because film is this huge, and I'm just going to talk specifically about film rather than television. But I wanted to give it a mention because it's a large part of our collection. You'll know the BBC in the UK has its own archive, of course, but there's an interrelation between the collections. But for film, we go right back to 1895 in terms of materials here, and we're collecting right now masters, uncompressed digital masters of the latest British, or those that have received some funding from the BFI. So they're being preserved as right from the off. And I've been here 20 years, and it's really within the last 15 of those where I was heavily involved with the restoration program. The first project I began with, cut my teeth on, were the first films of Charlie Chaplin. So when he moved to the US and Keystone Film Company employed him, he made about 30, they made a film every fortnight, really knockabout stuff. And we worked in a collaborative project with the Cineteca in Bologna and Lobster Films in Paris to bring together material from around the world on these very first films of Chaplin to begin the work of assessing properly those, because they've been pirated and cut up by later distributors. Similarly, I've also been involved in a project to restore the first 10 films of David Lean. People will know him often from the later films like Lawrence of Arabia, Bridge on the River Kwai, Passage to India. But the first 10 films that he made in the UK from the early 40s to the early 50s are very interesting and key works of his cinema as well as British cinema. So it's fortunate that the Hitchcocks are one of 3 projects where they're not completist, but they're the first works of very important film figures. Other examples, last year we finished work on Victorian cinema, using latest digital technologies to capture large format, almost like a Victorian IMAX, 68mm film. MoMA in New York holds a lot of similar examples made by the Biograph company, and it's very, very high resolution film from the beginnings of cinema, more or less. So we had those scanned and represented, and if you're in the UK, you're able to watch those on the BFI's player online. I'm afraid for rights issues, it's not possible outside of the UK, but so that's the very earliest examples. you just have to stop me. I've been fortunate that I could work on 3-strip Technicolor, on Kodachrome originals, on Dufay Color. I love all the different color systems within cinema's history. So this collection is more than a lifetime's work.
I remember your fondness for color, and we'll certainly want to talk about that in a little bit. But I'm sure everybody's waiting. I could talk about this all day, like you. I think everybody's waiting to hear about The Lodger. And you mentioned the Hitchcock 9. Why 9? And how did the decision to focus on Hitchcock and those particular 9 films come about?
Well, the year 2012 was a very special one in the UK. Not only was it the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, the Olympics were held in London that year, and we were asked to really to devise the film events as part of what was known as the Cultural Olympiad in London that year. So these restorations and their public screenings initially in London were the film part of that Cultural Olympiad. And Hitchcock, I know he's such an obvious figure in many ways. You know, why wouldn't you restore Hitchcock's films for an event like this, or at a moment like this? Because he's like those other great figures of which is where we wanted to place him within the cultural life generally of the UK. But it allowed us also to reveal him as a Londoner, a key figure in the film industry. By the time he's started directing, he's worked on nearly all of the other jobs that are in film studios at the time, and it made sense to us to present all these films, some of which are very atypical. The Lodger is what you would imagine an early Hitchcock to be, but there are other films like The Farmer's Wife, which is this kind of rural comedy, and it doesn't seem typical of him in the least. In fact, if you showed it to people without revealing his name, I don't suppose anyone would guess Hitchcock directed it, really. So we wanted to bring those films together and restore them to provide the modern preservation masters, as it were, for the long term. And there are 9 of them, because he directed 10 films actually in the silent era, but one of them, The Mountain Eagle, is lost. It must be close to being the top of the most desired lost films to be rediscovered. Only a few stills.
We mentioned that last week. I mentioned it because I said, if that is ever found by some miracle, it will be all over the news, and all of our participants will know why. I mean, it's like, I don't know, Valhalla or Atlantis. It's just one of those legendary things, the Mountain Eagle. So it's everything but the Mountain Eagle, which you would have if you could have, but it's not here. So
yeah, absolutely, yeah. So those that provided the immediate impetus for us, and the opportunity to generate the funding. A large part of restoration is gaining the resources in order to carry these out, and we were fortunate that the Film Foundation, established 30 years ago, I think, by Martin Scorsese, was a very generous supporter of several of these restorations, alongside other patrons of ours who are very generous in their donations to our restoration work. But we also created a public campaign, give what you could, save a frame almost, which was very well, really humblingly supported by the general public, the interest in these, in the work of this time. So that it came together in a marvelous sort of moment, culminating in the release of these films, which have been seen now in more than 30 countries, I think. They've traveled far and wide.
Those restorations have had such an impact. We were able to watch the one for the lodger. That's readily available. And anymore, when you look at those early films, you can get the BFI's quality restoration. The pretty poor quality films that existed earlier are not as widely available. So those films have been shown not only in theaters and film festivals, but people watch them in their homes. I mean, they've had a huge impact, I think, on our understanding of early Hitchcock too. Now you've talked, we're leading up to it, and I know our audience is waiting with bated breath about the process involved in restoring films. Most of us don't do it. It's very technical, it's highly specialized, and I know this is going to open a big door and you just walk right through it. But what sorts of challenges do you face that people should know about when you're restoring a film, or in the lodger in particular, however you want to approach it?
Yeah, I'll probably talk around both. Some of these things will apply generally, and some of them are specific to the lodger. I'm going to try to share my screen here, Susan, so you'll have to let me know if you're seeing what I hope you're seeing, because I think the images are, well, you'd expect me to say this, but the images tell much more of the story than I can. So
yes,
so it's coming up.
Yes, it is. We see Alma there in her reading chair, looking very comfortable.
Yeah, excellent, great. It's really important to stress, actually, throughout his life, Alma's importance. I haven't actually brought myself to watch them, but there were a couple of biopics of Hitchcock around 2012. One with Anthony Hopkins and one with Toby Jones. And she featured in both, I think. But she was more experienced in the film industry than Hitchcock, was a great script developer, I suppose, and almost like a producer role. So she's a very key figure in his life. There's a touching moment when he was given his Lifetime Achievement Award by the American Film Institute, in which he said that he'd known all these people in his life, and he listed all the different roles, and he said, and their name is Alma. So she has, just like him, a brief, well, you'll know, for like this example from Blackmail, that Hitchcock enjoyed appearing in cameos in his films. Well, Alma appears, here he is in the lodger with his back to us. Alma appears in the lodger, and this is actually that's her. So this is when people are here listening to the wireless near the start of the film about the news of the Avenger and his crimes spreads on the radio. She's one of the agitated people listening to those reports. This photo shows the film being projected just above the orchestra who performed the new score at the film's premiere at the Barbican in July of that year. Well, when we're starting a film restoration, we need actual film materials. It's there's no substitute for that. Here's a view inside one of our vaults with the benefactor then, John Paul Getty Jr., examining, looking out for some choice title. And nowadays, this is the latest master film vault that we have on a different site. And this keeps the films there below zero, well, below 0 Celsius. Sorry, I haven't done the conversion. At -5 degrees Celsius and 35% relative humidity. So film likes to be kept cold and pretty dry, relatively dry. And you need to look at original film elements and gather them all together when you want to undertake restoration. You'll know, as I mentioned earlier, that this can mean bringing in copies from around the world, and even just undertaking the search to establish that whether or not you have the best elements. It turned out for the lodger that we did, and so you need to start preparing them by hand in order that they might travel through a film scanner, which I'll show in a moment.
So sometimes it's the case, as I understand it, that archives might have pieces. They might have one reel, they might have one sequence. So when you're restoring a film, do you sort of put out a call saying, all income free, whatever you've got, here's your chance?
Yeah, exactly that. There's an international federation of film archives, public archives, you might say, and we had a great response to our call. And it brought many interesting stories. Actually, one of Hitchcock's films called The Ring, one of his silent films, a boxing picture. There was a copy in the archive in Toulouse, and in fact, it was the first film that archive ever acquired, and they bought a copy in the flea market in Toulouse.
Wow.
So there's yes, we were interested in. Because it's rare that films from this era survive in a very integral way. They're not complete often. They can be missing huge chunks, and somebody might have a section that's of very high quality or of missing footage. So we'll be looking for as many copies as we could bring together, and do the kind of comparison that you can see. My colleague Claire doing here. There's no substitute for laying the films out, working on machines such as these, similar to these, in order to compare them all frame by frame and work out the original edit and the shot order. And you'll see here from top to bottom, there's negative and positive, coloured, tinted copies, as well as black and white. I'll explain a bit about that in a moment. But she's bringing these together. She's measuring how shrunk they are, where they're missing frames in comparison to each other, and how they relate in a kind of family tree. Actually, we draw for films. This one made this one, or this one derives from both of these. This shows a title card. I don't know how well this impression can work as a still, but on the left-hand side, you see the restored part of the card, and on the right, you see the original. So you can see intertitles and titles are very important within silent films, and the lodgers are really distinctive because of that modernist kind of artwork that underpins them. And we knew that that we had a good set of those, but we kind of reconstructed them very accurately. We always make sure we're using the originals as a basis, and then bringing the contrast back, clearing the dirt and wear that's built up over decades in order to represent them accurately. And in the lodger, you'll know that they act as scene setters and dialogue, sometimes you could say, within silent films. Hitchcock wouldn't have used them unnecessarily. He loved pure cinema, as he called it, even within his later films. You can see those sequences. So when we've gathered together the original nitrate elements, they're on a film material known as cellulose nitrate, which was great for making films on, but highly flammable. If it starts burning, you can't put it out. The process of the fire generates its own oxygen and feeds itself, really. So has to be handled carefully, but is very, very beautiful in some cases, subject to chemical decomposition in others. You see Ben, he was our sort of leader on the image quality of these restorations, and he's operating an ARRI scan, which we use to scan frame by frame. That's a camera there, really, that he's just cleaning out before he starts scanning, to capture all the images we need. And for a film like The Lodger, that might be more material than in the finished version. You might need the same shot, but from different copies to reconstruct it in its fullest form. And this is a very, very complex machinery that Ben's operating, and attuning it to the condition of the films that will be damaged. And the pencil behind his ear is very essential, as you can see. He hasn't got one behind each ear. I think he's probably just changed. Here he is checking the scans for Blackmail, a different Hitchcock film. Now, these are tinted and toned examples. In the silent cinema, the film materials were black and white. They didn't capture the colour of the world in the sense that we would understand it from later on. They captured a black and white image, but they coloured the film itself to give an impression of the narrative mood, the setting. Is it daylight or nighttime? Is it a romantic scene? Or is there a fire going on somewhere? And this has been looking at some examples from other films as he's scanning to make sure that he's capturing it in the most accurate way. We want to reproduce it within the finished articles. And you might think the colours are somewhat bright or oversaturated, but these are examples of slides, really, from the 20s, around about the time that these Hitchcock features were being made. And they give some idea of how bright and punchy those can be within examples that exist in good condition. Many don't. The colour is patchy or faded, but we want to restore it in its with its original brilliance. Mm-hmm. So that is definitely a key part of what we want to do within restoration. So it's capturing the picture in the best way through the scanner, having undertaken the sort of editorial work that Claire was doing to understand how films have changed. There's no scripts for these films. There's no paperwork really associated with them still surviving. So we have to deduce all this from the original copies, and we can use some forms of dating them to understand what might be later interventions in the films.
That's very important. I'm sorry, that's very important to know. And I know one of the things that we'll talk about with the lodger is titles, intertitles. I don't know if you want to talk about that now as far as putting it together, but I think our participants are interested in, if we don't have scripts, then how do we know, and how do you know where the intertitles are?
Well, in most cases, we will need to bring all those film copies together and study them. We can apply methods of dating film stocks. We understand when they were released. Sometimes it's even indicated on the edge of the film. We're looking a lot. If you imagine a film strip here, the images are within this area, and this part of the film strip though can contain a lot of useful information for us, so we can relate it to understanding about the film manufacturer and what year they might have produced this stock. So you might have a later copy of a film from 26 and somebody's altered the edit for their own purposes. With the lodger, I do think it is my hypothesis, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to prove it, but my feeling is that what we hold here as the original master element is several reels of nitrate print film, so the actual copy that would have gone to cinemas at the time, rather than, unfortunately, the original negative that would have gone through the camera. If you have the original negative, you can reproduce images of the real stunning quality. You know, that's the best possible source for that reason. For most of these Hitchcock films, like many other silent era movies, we're lucky to have any kind of copy at all. The loss rate is generally reckoned to be 80% of the films that were made.
I think that's
So
something we talk a lot about in film history classes, but you almost want to shout it from the housetops that here we're talking about the earliest years of one of the most important mediums that we have, and 80% of it's gone, in large part because they were flammable materials. And I remember there were all sorts of stories in the New York Times about the New York theaters of films blowing up. There were major fire hazards in the early 20th century because the little rooms where they would show movies constantly blew up and people would get killed. I mean, it was not pretty. So it's really amazing that we have anything left. It really is, and especially something as major as Hitchcock's early films.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, we're fortunate that it's only one of his features that he directed that's lost. So for Blackmail, for example, we have the original camera negative, and that meant that the sharpness, the definition, you know, the lighting is really fully reproduced in the new copies. For the Lodger, I think it looks terrific in the new copies, but it's true that it won't have looked quite as beautiful as it did on projection in 1926. But
we're happy with what you did. And you mentioned Intertitles, and I know our participants are very interested in how the films are put together. And we know that at some point early on, the film had a lot more intertitles, and then Ivor Montagu stepped in. And as I recall, you actually have written information about that to go on. Is that the case?
yes, within our special collections, which really are the paper and posters, press books, the non-film materials collection. Well, I didn't discover, but I was fortunate enough to see that we hold the original typescript lists of the intertitles. And the first ones that were written were very flowery and very descriptive, really overdone. And Montagu came in, and first of all, he cut the number of them. There were a lot more intended originally, I think. And it's likely that somebody else had the responsibility for those titles. Not, you know, I would expect Hitchcock would have been aware what the studio wanted to do, but you'll also know that a couple of these early films of Hitchcock's, the release was held up because there were arguments within the studio about how arty they were and that they wouldn't be popular. And of course, they were as soon as they released them. So it's likely somebody else had the responsibility for scripting the titles originally. But Montagu made the right call. I think we have to agree in reducing the number. I think something like by a third to a half. You know, he really cut down the number, and he just made them much more direct and simple, because the storytelling is all through the picture, really, and you just might need a card to tell you it's later that night or it's the next day, or just almost as a breathing space between these very tense moments within the film. So the lists. Well, I was so excited to be looking at the original list, but also it made me realise that the copy we do hold, just go back to my pet theory about it, it's probably been cannibalised is the wrong word, because that would make you think it's somebody else put the edit together. But I think it's made up of individual reels from different copies. So imagine there were 2 copies originally of the Lodger. And maybe what we hold now, what's come down to us through history, is 1 copy, but with a reel, a few reels from each of the 2. And the intertitle list, though, told me we had them in the right order, and we had them all. So I think when you watch the film, the continuity does feel good, doesn't it? It doesn't feel choppy and that there's a shot in the wrong position or that they end too early. I think and I can't, as you said, we can't overemphasize this. Not all silent films would be so lucky.
And One question too that our participants asked, which is very interesting. So we are fortunate to have that information about the lodger. People are asking, so how do you know how many shots go in between? And I think, you know, is it long, is it short? And I think you got at that when you said that you compare different versions and you can sort of judge that way. So it's, you know, you might have a print that has 1 minute in between an intertitle and a print that has 10 minutes in between an intertitle. Usually it's not that extreme. But I think you would find that out by comparing prints, because you can't really decide for yourself, oh, this should be longer, if there's no footage to support that, I think.
Right, exactly, yes. It's the lodger is I think that the signs are to me that the lodger is a film that's always survived quite well. So maybe it had people looking after it throughout its life, compared to others. The first film of Hitchcock's that he directed, The Pleasure Garden, was in a much more parlous state and had existed in different copies in circulation, so much so that people thought they'd almost been edited that way originally. But we were able, in that case, to borrow a copy from the Dutch archive, the I Film Museum in Amsterdam, that acted almost like a key and allowed us to see how all the other copies fit together. Mm-hmm. So that's other clues you can look at. We can tell the difference between somebody making changes directly on the copy that you hold, mm-hmm. or did they do it in the generation before, as we say, so in a negative. Did they mess around with that? Did they cut some shots down or change the order? Or are we looking at somebody who did this in a print? And all these things build up together to give us the best sense of the original continuity. So you're looking for very physical marks on the film to understand how it's been handled.
And I think this also speaks to the expertise of restoration artists such as yourself, that you build up this knowledge, this sense of how films work in different time periods. I'm not sure what that is. I'm being still. How films work in different time periods so that you can get a sense of that.
Yeah.
Another question that's come in is the soundtrack. The lodger has a soundtrack. And sometimes I know there are musical cues either from the records or from something else. In some cases, you commission a soundtrack. Would you tell us about the music for this?
Yeah, I apologise if you're hearing any of there is some building work going on, okay. So we'll have to see how this goes.
Live from the UK, this is very exciting. Ambient sound, as we would say.
Yeah. Over here it's after hours, so they feel like they can start making a noise, of course. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There are some very, very epic silent productions like.
Sounds like a monster. I love it. Like who is it? Not.
It must be.
Who is the medieval monster? Grendel? I should know. It sounds like.
I was thinking of Beowulf. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry about this. So.
Okay.
The music has always been an important part of silent cinema, and actually, this will give me a chance to recommend, for those who are interested in reading more about film preservation work, Silent Cinema by Paolo Kirchi-Ozai, which is a BFI book, but also available in the States, is a great introduction to a lot of these topics, actually. And
a huge figure in the field of restoration, extremely important.
Yeah. So, they were never silent as such, even if it was a flea pit cinema that just had one old guy on a piano. There would have been some kind of music. But very few films have music composed for them back then. And even if they did, it doesn't exist now. The scores don't often exist. So, and perhaps even if they did, we would still be interested now in commissioning new scores from contemporary artists to accompany the films. So each of these Hitchcock 9 had a score commissioned. Some of them had more than one, actually, and some of them were quite experimental. I wonder how all the participants felt if they watched the Lodger about the sudden introduction of the singing, which was controversial to some extent, I think, with some fans of silent cinema. But if you think that one of the other scores for a different movie had beatboxing, had a beatbox score. So I think the beauty of these films is that they can withstand or survive, or you know, can have lots of different types of scores with them, and still be a great experience. So that's the beauty of them. But each of these had a new score commissioned, and the Lodger's was recorded. It was written by Nitin Sawhney, who's written for other one or two silent films as well as his other compositions. So it was a score that picks up a lot on, as several others did, on Bernard Herrmann's work with Hitchcock, which is so distinctive. You'll hear just, you know, some of the same instrumentation and kind of phrasing, I suppose, that we know from Herrmann's.
Of course, our participants know that he did the music for Vertigo, for Psycho, North by Northwest. So there was a deliberate effort to link one of Hitchcock's early films with his later ones. I didn't know that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't something that the BFI asked. I mean, actually, in this case, it wasn't the BFI that commissioned this score, but we worked in conjunction with Nitin when he was writing the score to make sure he always had the. If we ever found any new footage, we always have to make a little version for the composer that's to the right length. But I think several of the composers had Herrmann in their mind. How could they not? I suppose it's such incredible music, and it was well within the spirit of the project that, like recognizing Alma's contribution, the collaborators that Hitchcock was so keen to work with.
One question has come in that's interesting. I don't think it's the case, but one of our participants asked if restorers ever go back to the literary text from which a film was adapted. I'm trying to think of reasons why you would do that. Does that happen very often?
That's a brilliant question, actually. I like that. I can't think of many examples where I've heard that it's happened. Often because it could mislead you, of course, as much as it could be useful if the adaptation is very, very different. And your primary source in restoration will always be these original film copies, as I was saying. We didn't need to go back to the novel of the Lodger but if the film of the Lodger had survived in a very different way, I can imagine doing that and finding that useful. So it's a brilliant thought, actually. Although we've worked on several restorations, more than several, I'm sure, that come from plays or from novels, I don't recall that we've had to do that. The curators will want to do it because they're looking at the interpretations of the material subject. But as a restorer, no, but I won't ever forget that. It's a fascinating thought for the future. Yeah.
You're right. Those of us who are studying adaptations is critical, but it's done, as it were. So that's what you would concentrate on. Another question that came in, it's interesting, and I think this is the case. Sometimes restorers find copies with different endings or significantly different parts between films. Have you encountered that at all, and what do you do in that case?
Yes, we have, and our approach here is we're looking to represent the original UK release. That would be barring some odd examples, that would be our work as the BFI. It's interesting because in this period where Hitchcock's working, and that's what makes these films so fascinating, because they're examples of when the feature film in its more sophisticated narrative form that we know even today is by the late 20s is really compared to just 10 or 15 years earlier in cinema history, they're so much more sophisticated in the narration. And during this period, as you're probably aware, and those joining us, blackmail became Britain's first talking picture. So it was, at the time, it was released in both cinemas, in both silent and sound versions, depending on whether cinemas had converted yet to sound. I guess a bit like 3D every once in a while. So we've worked on, so when we were working on Blackmail and another British feature where the same thing happened, where there was a part talkie and a silent version, we want to make sure that we're using the exact shots that appeared in the silent version. Often they shared, the producers would use the same footage twice, but obviously for the talking scenes where lip sync is important, they couldn't do that. So we would always make sure, and sometimes it breaks your heart because the shot you need to be accurate is terribly beat up, and you've got this beautiful, pristine, same shot, but from a different angle or a different take. It's somewhere else, but we wouldn't use it for that reason. So the only example similar to that in the Hitchcock project was The Pleasure Garden, where we needed to bring these 5 key copies together from the US, from the Netherlands, from France, and our own collection, to realise what the original edit was like. But it's very, if you'd only seen it in one of the other versions that used to circulate, that it would seem very different to you. Almost, it's hard to talk about running time with silent films, but almost 20 minutes, like a quarter of the movie is sort of, that's the nature of the change in that one. So the Lodger, luckier, I think, through its life in being preserved in more complete form from the old.
And I'm so glad that our participants can watch it online and through the Criterion DVD and other DVDs. I know the Pleasure Garden is available online. It's not as glorious as The Lodger, but that is online. I'm being told we have time for one more question, and I'm going to sneak in a little one after that. So as our semi-final question, tell us about the premiere. You mentioned there was an orchestra. It must have been a big deal as part of the Olympics.
Yes, I mean, yeah, that whole summer was really a really glorious one. The Olympics did make a huge difference to London. I mean, we attended as a family one day an event, and the trains ran on time. The sun was shining. It felt like I was living somewhere else. And in amongst all that, the result of, because maybe there's 40 of us working on these restorations when there's 9 features to premiere at the same 6-week period, and the first film, The Pleasure Garden, premiered first, that restoration, at Wilton's Musical, which is a fantastic example of an original 19th century, maybe older musical in London. The Ring premiered at the Hackney Empire, which we're sure that Hitchcock would have attended as a venue in his youth. And the Barbican is this tremendous venue for music, of course, as well as other arts, for the Lodger's premiere. So you suddenly sit back in this film that you've watched over and over and over and cared for and scanned and brought together and reintroduced the colour, is being shared with an audience and their reaction to it. And often, in fact, I think in all the examples, it was the first time I was hearing the music. And that just, I know this will sound like a cliche, but even for us, it was like watching it for the first time. I'm just going to share a couple of photos from other premieres. I mean, when premieres they received around the world, because you won't believe. So this was just explaining how we reintroduced the colour. We found the close-up of a missing cup of tea for the Pleasure Garden, which you can imagine in Britain was a big event. So here's the premiere of Blackmail outside the British Museum, which features in the film.
In there, yes.
Everybody took a Hitchcock selfie before the show. This is the same kind of event in Shanghai.
Wow.
This is Blackmail, the premiere of Blackmail on the Odessa steppes.
Holy heavens.
In Ukraine, just after the Russians had moved in. It's estimated 25,000 people came to watch the premiere of this film in 2014. And this is the best one. This is the Pleasure Garden on Copacabana Beach, an outdoor screening. So you can see, but of course the London premieres were special to us, you know, and those who could be there.
Well, this has been very special for us, and obviously we could go on and on. I know it's your dinner hours, so we're even more grateful that you were able to take the time to be with us. But thank you, Karen, for putting all the images together, for giving such careful thought to all these important elements of the restoration. I think everybody's delighted to meet you, and just thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and it was a really great pleasure. It was a nice trip down memory lane, and all best wishes to you and those in the book club for the weeks that you continue. The Secret Agent is one of my favourite novels, and it's one of the, Sabotage is one of the greatest Hitchcocks, I think. So
we are agreed on that. So thank you so much. Next week, and Karen gave us that wonderful preview, we're going to talk about the novel, The Secret Agent, which will set us up for discussing Hitchcock's film Sabotage in our fourth week. The reading is available. All my videos are available. The novel deals with the anarchist movement in London at the end of the 19th century. And there's a lot of material I put in there from the illustrated newspapers that we know influenced Hitchcock's approach to the novel. So I think you'll find that interesting. You can get to it by going to this week's page to the very bottom and just clicking next. So everything is all set up for you. Thank you very much.